So it's a warm welcome from Catalyst Wonfor and my dear friend Ruth, who's joining the session today. We will be showing some slides in a short while, but we thought we'd start the session on camera just to connect, as we understand it's an important time for everybody to have that sense of connection at the moment. So Ruth and I go back a long way. We actually trained and did our MSc in coaching together. And when Ruth and I were planning this session last year, of course, we were unaware of the situation that we'd be currently in. So at some level, I'm really appreciative that we're able to share some of Ruth's thinking in the current situation today. Ruth, before I do any setup, was there anything you'd like to say just at the start, just to connect with the group?
Oh, well, yeah, hello. Thank you very much for asking me to share some of this. I've always been really interested in what enables us, irrespective of what happens, there's changes in the environment, how we can actually respond. And at this particular time, as you say, it could be more apt, so it'd be great to share whatever's going to be useful.
Thank you, Ruth. Thank you. And today's session will be recorded. Just some pieces of housekeeping, really. Session will be for around about 45 minutes. After today, the session will appear on the YouTube channel, so you'll be able to access it there if you would like to watch it again. We will be trying to make this session purposeful for you. So in a short while, I will pause and just see what questions you have around this topic that we can bring into the dialogue that Ruth and I will be having around resilience and adaptability. So that's what we'll be doing in a short while. Please feel free to add any reflections or questions as we're going through the session as well, because there will be plenty of opportunity to bring those in. As always, you're on listen-only mode, so I would encourage you to close down any other applications or web browser, and that just supports the transmission speed, just to manage any I suppose interferences around that, as we're all on our Wi-Fi currently working. I'd always encourage you to have a pen and paper handy, because I'm sure there's going to be lots of sharing of Ruth's wisdom on this session as well. There you go, Ruth, building up a bit.
Yeah, thanks.
And really just to introduce Ruth. So yeah, I mean, I've known Ruth a long time as a coach, but Ruth also works as a consultant, I suppose at many levels, organizational, with teams and groups and individuals. And Ruth's work is really about helping individuals understand how they respond and adapt to change. And currently Ruth's working on her PhD around this very topic, and specifically looking at group coaching to support leaders in transition to senior leadership roles. So yeah, as I said at the beginning, I'm really appreciative, Ruth, of you making the time to speak to the group today.
Hey, you're welcome. Looking forward to it.
Good. So before we get going, and Ruth and I are just going to switch our cameras off, and I'm going to pull up the slides. But while I'm doing that, it'll just be great if we can pause for a moment and just invite you to share any areas that you're interested in, or focus for this session, questions you may be having around this topic of resilience and adaptability. So please feel free to add those to the chat panel. So we're just going to pause for a moment and just see what questions come through. So any questions that you're holding you would like us to talk to today, just please add those to the chat panel. So thank you, Helen and Mandy, for the first questions coming through, and Kit. Great. So some great questions coming through and reflections, Ruth.
Indeed.
You can sort of see those coming through.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm going to just reflect on some of those as they're coming, but
Yeah.
maybe let's just start with a broad question, Ruth, because we've got these two headings on the slide in front of us: resilient, and then also adapt. So perhaps, if it's okay, if you start with discussing the difference between resilience and adaptation.
Yeah, of course. And perhaps that will help by explaining a bit about where this comes from in terms of my interest in the subject. I spent the early part of my career with ESSO and then management consulting with PwC, and spent a lot of time managing and implementing change. And the question that I was always interested in was, what do we do to help people adapt to it? Because so often we talk about, well, you'll go through this, but it particularly came up on an early offline project I did when I was at ESSO, and we were trying to set up a new customer service center. And my original background was marketing and PR, and I always thought, if you craft the right message, then everyone will get it. And of course, they will then do what you're asking them to. And I realized then that that's clearly not the case, and that there was so much to it. And so I think that's what sparked my interest in certainly adaptability. That's where it came from. I did my master's research on exploring the attributes as to what allows people to adapt, and that was really interesting. But at the time, I kept coming across this point, oh no, resilience. In fact, someone I knew really well kept talking about my research about resilience. I said, it's not, it's about adapting, about adaptability. And so then that sent me down the right direction to explore what resilience is, and what the difference is, because I really felt there was a difference between the two. And ultimately, the answer is in the end state. If you just go to the next slide, Damion, to be resilient, for me, is commonly understood to be about responding to disruption and returning to a former state following that disruption. You know, people often talk about catching a ball and it taking you in, and then you come back out again. It's also related to stress coping. But ultimately, you're going back to the same state at the end. Wherefore, adapting is changing or adjusting to fit new conditions. So ultimately, the difference from what I've seen and experienced is that it's the extent to which the end state is changed or different to how it was originally. That's, in summary, how I see the difference.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Ruth. And so I've just seen a reflection for Naomi about resilience being about growing through change. So
yeah,
go on, carry on.
Yeah, and undoubtedly, as I think I put in the blog post, we could spend a long time debating what is resilience and what is adaptability, because, as you say, every time we grow, we're slightly different. And if we respond to something, and yes, we're going back to the same state, but how can we be the same state because something affected us? So we won't ever be the same. And you're absolutely right. There is a really close relationship between resilience and adaptability. But I think as far as a coach is concerned, it's understanding the difference and what is required for the client at that point in time.
Thank you, Ruth. And so can you just talk a bit more then about why this is important for coaches to know the difference?
Sure. I think it's understanding what's going to be most productive for the client, because the other big difference about resilience and adaptability is the energy that's required to do it. If when I was looking at adaptation, I came across two different types of adaptation. One is quite static, and that involves changing something technical. So that could be you are working from home as opposed to in an office. On one level, that's technical because you're working in a different geography. You're working in a different place. And then dynamic adaptation is when you are doing something, you're having to think differently about something. So that's when a psychological element needs to come in to change it. And for example, with hand washing, we all washed our hands before COVID-19. But perhaps what's changed now is that we all believe how important that is. So we're washing our hands in a different way. So there was an element of psychological shift there that's allowed people to put more effort and time into washing their hands. So there's kind of static technical adaptation, which is just learning a new skill that you haven't had before. And then there's dynamic adaptation, which involves a psychological shift. So that's thinking differently to enable you to do it well. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And you can start to think about some of the challenges that we're facing actually. And in terms of this whole piece of the psychological aspect of adapting, which is really resonating for me in my practice, Ruth. So can you just perhaps talk a bit more just about we're touching on this already, but I think it's just useful in terms of similarities and differences.
Yeah, sure. So if I bring it back to the clients, to my experience of clients, there's two kind of key differences that once we were aware of whether it was resilience or adaptability worked differently. So there was one client I was working with, a food manufacturer, and he was really struggling working with one of his colleagues. He was coming towards the end of his career, and it was proving to be a real problem for him. And we looked at the situation and reframed it as actually a gift to his own development, because it was using skills that he'd already got, but in a different way. He was struggling with this individual personally, and it was just about him thinking about the situation differently and then using tools and skills that he'd already used before differently. So the end state wasn't different, other than, and it was just using tools, behaviors that he'd already used before. Whereas there was another client who he was a senior leader and moving into his position, and his boss was concerned because he wasn't able to bring the hopefulness. He'd come across as very earnest and very serious, and part of this was because that's what he felt leadership was about. And then through conversations, we explored how different that was to how he really was, and so he was able to create his own vision for leadership, and that released some of the fun side of him that he'd been squashing. And so as a result of that, having that vision for the new leadership, it released him to then adapt and he saw himself differently, so he behaved differently, and that brought about the change. So there was a real psychological shift in the way he adapted, as opposed to the first client, where it was just about doing something slightly differently.
Thanks, Ruth. And so I suppose for me, and again, this is just bringing up a word like acceptance in this.
Acceptance in what regard?
Well, I'm thinking about both clients. There's a sense of being able to accept the situation they're in before they adapt.
Yeah, and I think it is also seeing the point that we have a choice. If you go to the next slide, the pathway for being resilient and adapting. Oh, sorry, it's a build. Can you just press it through? Ultimately, this is years of consultancy, input, process, output. There's that point at which something happens. Identify, I need to make some kind of change here, or there's a trigger. And then we evaluate it. Okay, what does this actually mean for me, this input? And then there's a response. And then that's either I need to stay in the same state, or I need to make a change to the different state. But ultimately, we have a choice. Is it about, you hear the classic example of us being like computer systems, where you just keep loading the software until the computer crashes. often that's because we haven't looked to make sure that everything we're taking on is actually appropriate. We often used to talk about how a lot of the work used to be around resilience was just a way of getting people to do more and more and just piling it on them and saying, oh, you've got to be resilient. Whereas actually the prudent step was to consider what was happening. In order to thrive on a biological level and in any situation, therefore, it's what we're going to keep, what's important, what are we going to drop, what is no longer relevant, and what do we need to develop. And it is that exploration that allows you then to adapt and change the state at the end of it, as opposed to be resilient, absorb the impact, and then return to the same state.
And I'm just, I suppose, looking at your model, Ruth. I mean, obviously, I can see the connection with Prochaska and Kubler-Ross.
Yeah.
But I suppose in terms of, as a coach, working with someone around this process, what else might the coach be doing? I suppose I'm wondering, because coaching sessions are great, but what are coaches doing to reinforce this, the coachee to be able to move to a change state?
I think it's understanding what the context for the client, but also where the energy for the client is, as you say. And I've just seen the comments, on one level, all of this, whether you're being resilient or adapting, is a change of mindset. It's what you do with that, and how different the end state is, and where the client's energy is to change, because it is ultimately a choice. Actually, what I need to do, I was working with one client who had a really difficult boss, was really struggling there. We were focusing time, effort on resources, on how they could build up the energy that they needed, how they could build up the resources to respond to their current situation. So it was about looking after themselves better so that they weren't taking things very personally. It was all about those specific interactions, versus for other leaders, it's thinking about their whole leadership offering. What is important for them moving forward? What energy have they got to change? For example, in senior leadership, the transition that we're often talking about is, what can we let go of that's no longer serving us? And what's the vision that we're talking about for the future? Because then that provides the energy. Adaptation requires a lot of energy, because you've got to go down this loop of, what do I need to keep, drop, and develop? It needs to be really strong to ditch those habits that are not serving you well anymore. So it's difficult to drop things, and it's hard work to develop different ways of being and behaving, because it requires an awful lot of energy and testing and experimenting. And so that's why the energy the client has available is really important, and the situation and how important it is that they make a change, versus actually, no, I just want to, batten down the hatches and get through this. And ultimately, it's for the client. It's perhaps for us to help them understand what the implications of going both routes are.
Yeah, and at the same time, Ruth, I suppose there's something like you're saying about the energy that's required, and so especially in the current situation as coaches, how can we, be supporting the clients to think about, if willpower is a finite resource, just about everything they need to do to keep that energy healthy and resourced, I would say. So I've just seen a couple of points come through from Debbie. For instance, there's a balance to be struck with experiencing the emotion in response to change and not suppressing it, to moving on to evaluation and responding.
Without doubt. And the more I'm researching the transition process, I'm seeing how important that recognition of emotion is. There is a theory, Mandler's interruption theory, that shows we experience arousal to disruption. And there is a real risk that people don't appreciate that. It does beg the question for some people at the moment, to what extent they are actually embracing the emotion of this. This is a really difficult situation we are all living under. And to what extent people have had a good cry about it, because that emotion is there. And if you don't let it out, somehow, then it's going to come back later on. So whether you're having to, respond to a disruption that you can then return to your same state, or you need to adapt and be different, that emotional point is really, really important, because if you don't work with that emotion and get through it, then it's going to come back and bite you later on.
Thanks, Ruth. And just if we carry on this line, actually, anything more about how this works in practice, would you say?
In terms of working with the client, it's about also understanding the capacity of the client. If the client wants to adapt and become a leader full of hopefulness, it's understanding what that means specifically to that individual and setting really small targets to move forward and make that change towards that point. And realizing that people will all move different stages. Whether whoever you're working with, there is a real frustration. Well, this hasn't happened straight away. With resilience, it's a lot easier in the extent that it's about developing the resources to withstand whatever disruption. And so we can talk between sessions as to how that's gone and how people have felt. Whereas when you're actually trying to do something differently, it does take time to do it and see the effects that you're looking for. So I think where the client is in terms of their vision to change, their energy to see a different vision and adapt, but also their capacity to make the changes necessarily along the way.
And I'm just seeing some points coming through on the chat panel. So again, when working with a client, this is from Damion, what tools would you use to guide the client towards resilience or adaptation?
Well, in terms of specific tools, it would just depend what their kind of issue. It was interesting with the client and the food manufacturer. We worked around emotional intelligence because it was how he could see that actually he did have the tools available, that he just wasn't using them in that regard. So it would depend what the issue was. The one model, if you go to the next slide, Damion, the one model that I use probably with most of my clients is this one, in terms of it's based on DILT, the logical levels in organization system, and really clearly demonstrates that the technical shifts are on the outside of the onion, if you like, where you are learning to do something differently. All those years ago, when I started working consulting and we were talking about process re-engineering, it was just about doing things differently. Now, more and more, especially when we need to adapt, I often talk about working with law firms, for example, when partners, when there was a big drive to open plan offices, whether it was law firms or professional services, whatever. But if a partner doesn't see the benefit of collaborating, no end of open plan offices are going to achieve what they want to. It is only when you start to help people really see and understand the different ways of being and behaving that they can then be aware of it and then make a choice as to whether or not to change. So this helps to position the scale of work that's perhaps required and where people want to work at any one time.
Thanks, Ruth. And again, the whole I suppose the whole premise of this model is about sustainability in the system as well, in terms of the change, which I think is important, bearing in mind what we're talking about.
Well, I think it is. And I think that's one of the issues in terms of working with clients. Is it resilience or is actually adapting? Oh, well, I just need to get my head down and get through it. And when the two key attributes that came out when I was looking at the resources, what the attributes that enable people to adapt, there were two key things. One was, I called it inner freedom. That's a psychological term. The inner freedom to act comes from the psychotherapeutic arena, and it's about being able to see the reality of what is there, what is happening and seeing the triggers. Actually something really different is happening. How many of us that saw when Wuhan was shut down that actually it was going to come here? Some people may have thought, might be worth keeping an eye on, that might hit me, or no, won't come here. How you respond to that, the triggers when they come in, your awareness, how broad your view is really key, because that then defines, oh, actually there's something here I need to change to work on. And the second one is confidence in self and abilities, and having a lot of confidence in who you are and knowing who you are and what you can do will then help you adapt and respond. Because if you don't have that confidence, it's very difficult to have the courage to make some of the changes that are required.
And again, you can obviously relate that to the process we're undertaking when we're coaching, Ruth. I'm just thinking about how coaching as a process is enabling people to adapt. You know, if that's the intention. I just think sometimes coaches underestimate, and coaching clients underestimate how long it takes for this to happen. You know.
Absolutely, and I think that's why if you can perhaps share, there's an option here, in terms of the energy, effort, and capacity that's required to adapt, versus, okay, well, is this just about drawing on your own resources and seeing this through? And that's why I think it's really important to understand the context and where the individual client is, because adapting is a challenging process in certain circumstances.
So I'm just going to see, just because there's some other comments that have popped up onto the chat panel, Ruth, is there anything else you want to respond to just at this point?
I suppose if you were to summarize resilience and adapting, for me, I think resilience, whilst they are inextricably linked, and maybe at the end we'll look at the characteristics that support the two, I think resilience is about building resources and self-care, because when you look at the stress coping, it's about dealing with something that we can't handle. Whereas when we're resilient, we're able to handle it. So we avoid that kind of stress. And it especially at the moment, certain organizations, I know some people are just working from home and they are on the phone 8 hours. And whereas in the office, they would be up and about and moving to see people, and it's realizing, hang on, this is not a productive way to work. So how can I ensure that I can bring my best self to work during the day, because 8 hours of back-to-back conversations aren't going to help. So it's just kind of seeing those triggers and doing something about that. Whereas adapting is a lot about the work in terms of goals, testing. You still need to look after yourself in order to have the energy to do it, but it is more about that perhaps direction with adapting.
So do you perhaps want to move on, Ruth, because you mentioned characteristics there. So I mean, I think it'll be useful for people to reflect a bit more around these characteristics, especially for themselves, but also the clients they're working with.
Yeah. So these came, if you move to the next slide, Damion, these came from two sources. As I said, I'd researched adaptability, and then people kept talking to me about resilience. So I did an accreditation with the Resilience Alliance in the States, and they talk about productive use of energy in their resilience model, and they have a set of characteristics. And what I saw was that these four are kind of the bedrock between resilience and adaptability. So the firstly is the positive approach to change. That's viewing the world positively and looking for opportunities, solution focus, and forward thinking. It's interesting, people in the medical profession, there are some who are seeing this, yes, well, it's a challenge, okay, it's what we train for, it's going to test our mettle, we're going to see, not denying it's not going to be challenging, but okay, yeah, let's deal with it, versus those, we're dreading it, it's going to be a disaster. And I think you can all see the difference in your approach to this in terms of where that's going to lead you. And so looking for opportunities and solutions, yes, it's difficult and it's challenging. Okay, where what could be good here. And then coming back to this positive belief in self and abilities. So this is looking more internally, and that, you know, whatever happens, I can cope. I'm sure there's something in my toolbox that I can call on. That never ceases to amaze me in terms of what clients can bring to these situations when they realize, oh God, yeah, I did that before. Oh yeah, okay, I've done that before. Because it's so easy for us to forget what we're capable of doing. So I think really helping people recognize, you know, doing any kind of feed forward, any kind of 360, all of these provide great insights as to what people are good at. Intellectual flexibility, this is being able to think openly in the face of confusion and ambiguity, willing to let go of we always used to do this and envisage different futures, deal with this discomfort and suspend judgment. You know, I think the one thing that this has brought to the fore is how uncertain the world is, and ultimately, what is it, to quote Stelter about, you know, security and certainty are ultimately unattainable. And once you kind of appreciate that, you realize, yes, there's a risk of misjudgment, but I can't not do anything. And it's how to live with, yeah, I might get it wrong, but you know, how you're defining wrong, and at least it's doing something. So how open are you to that? And then this last one, the social flexibility, being able to identify and engage with people who could help. Often with resilience, you know, it's, oh, I've got to deal with it myself. I can't possibly ask for others for help, but ultimately that's one of the key sources. It's a key resource when you're going through any kind of change, whether you're just being resilient, dealing with a disruption and you need to go back to the same state, or you're adapting. But that input from other people, that ability to work with others, to call on others for help, is really important, whether you're just being resilient and getting through something or being different.
Yeah, and a great Ruth, and you know, I you know my background and my practice, and you know, I see a lot of connections with, you know, helping somebody be very much in the present, you know, and terms of, you know, the I suppose the benefits from having self-care practices like
Mm-hmm.
mindfulness, for instance, would, for me, speak to a number of these areas. So I just wondered, you know, in terms of, you've mentioned sort of the 360, you know, or other ways of developing that self-awareness around our strengths and what we're good at. I just wondered about any other particular interventions that, you know, would support people around some of these areas. So I can see Vijay's just asked about using more appreciative inquiry approaches to help people stay positive in these times. I just wondered what your thoughts are around, I suppose, specific things coaches could be doing.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I think there would be two key things at the moment for me. One would be to provide a space for the emotion to be shared and to come out. Because my sense is that people are reacting at the moment to what is going on. And absolutely, the mindfulness you mentioned will help in terms of responding as opposed to reacting. But I still think there's a degree of emotion. I think people need to kind of recognize this is actually quite a scary thing. You know, it's that classic question, well, what is the worst could happen? Well, actually, it could be a disaster, and it's almost get it out. Because once you've looked in the black hole and realized, actually, is that it? Is that what I'm worried about? Okay, maybe it's not so bad. And really getting to grips with it, because once you've explored it, you feel better. And then you can move on. So I think it is about that emotion, recognizing the emotion, and then that positivity. I think especially when you're inside an organization, it's very difficult to get your head up. And I think as coaches, if we can bring some positivity to the situation, it can be quite energizing when they've only been dealing with problems. So I think bringing that external positivity can make quite a big difference.
Mm. Thank you, Ruth. And I suppose that's just that sort of space in terms of, where they're in that reactive situation. Sometimes we're gonna have to shift them out of that space,
Well, yeah,
especially if they're in quite a negative frame about how things are playing out at the moment.
yeah, because to what extent are they also reacting like that because they just want an element of control?
Mm.
Okay, I just want to do something, so I'm going to do something that I know will make me feel better, not consciously, but oh well, I can do it, so therefore I will do it, without really thinking, taking the step back. What is it, Nancy Klein? Everything we do depends for its quality on the thinking we do first. Yet there's an awful lot of people who are just going straight to action at the moment, because in the absence of anything else, the ability to think and reflect. Well, I'll just hit the hole. At least I feel like I'm doing something.
Mm.
Whereas in actual fact, who has there are no kind of answers. It's just a question of how we're going to get through it.
Yeah, I agree. And just that whole piece of, I suppose, being able to recognize the thinking that's taking place, can be such a challenge when you say we're in that emotional response,
Yeah, absolutely.
So I'm just going to pause and just see if there are any other questions or reflections, just from the group that have been listening. Just any other questions coming through. So I can see there from Mandy, there's something about not feeling guilty about taking a step back and time out to think things through.
Yeah, this word guilt. Who is it that's making you feel guilty, and about what? If you're trying to be as effective as possible, why would you not be stepping back? Why would you feel guilty about that if you just want something to be as good as it possibly can? But you're right, we are, perhaps brought up and historically, well, you don't think about that, you just get on with it and do it. Yeah, really, really great point.
And so just a point from Henry around whether you agree now is a great time to focus group coaching around these areas.
Yeah, I mean, I'm quite new to group coaching. I did a team coaching course about 4 or 5 years ago, and really woke up to the opportunities that working in teams and groups at this level had. A lot of the work that I did when I was a consultant was, usual team development work, and all quite superficial. And suddenly realized the opportunities that are present to work in a group if you can create the right environment. But I was very cynical to coaching. I with an operational background, was it HR therapy? I didn't really understood where it fitted in, and that's what drove me to do an MSc to understand and get the answer. And in the same way, I think group coaching has some people are very nervous about it, and I think I am. There's a lot about group therapy, or how does it work, and you need to understand group dynamics, and you can't just get people together and talk about things. And so I think there's a fear for some people about what it involves, and certainly I'm a bit afraid about working in groups. Having said that, recently, having done more and more of it, I'm realizing the opportunity to put something in the middle of a group and all collaborate around the issue is incredibly, it's liberating for the attendees, but also can be hugely productive, because it gets rid of the need for an agenda as such, and one person having the responsibility for getting to an output. Look, this is what we're dealing with. How can we move forward on it? And what comes from clients is always hugely incredible in terms of what they've come to on their own. It's about creating that space to see how they come out of it. So yeah, groups really, really interesting. I did my first virtual team meeting 2 weeks ago, and was really thrilled with what we were able to achieve, even virtually. Quite a surprise.
Thanks, Ruth. And I can just see a number of comments coming through around sort of, supporting vulnerability in terms of people working with that. And again, I suppose one level I would say this is where the importance of the relationship that we've established, so the coachee can be held, by connecting to their vulnerability. But I would also say this is where some of the practices around sort of self-compassion are really useful to working with clients. Around that, actually.
Yeah. I just saw a comment there as well about the new routine, how to assist and support people to adapt to a new routine. I think some of this is to what extent we realize we can actually choose it. Yes, of course, there are other things that people want from us. And it's recognizing, okay, what are the givens that I've got to play with? And therefore, how am I going to create around that what I need? Because if we don't do anything to look after ourselves in this situation, we're not able to bring our best. And even if that, okay, can we, have a 5-minute break in this call just to stretch legs or whatever it is. But I think people having more confidence to speak out about what's going to help them be at their best, because I think if they do it, so other people will think, God, I'm really glad you said that. So I think now more than ever, perhaps we have a great opportunity now to really create our own routines in this situation that we've not had before.
So I'm conscious of us approaching time, Ruth, and I just wanted to say at this point, just what else would you like to just say about this topic that we haven't touched on, or alternatively, just any other resources that you could point people towards, perhaps?
I think in terms of resources, I can't think of any that come off the top of my head in terms of text. I suppose the next, the reason my research is looking at the transition to a senior leadership position is because I wanted to understand what this psychological process of adaptation means. So that's perhaps a topic for another day, and that's kind of going down, for anyone that's really interested in adapting, it's that's looking at a whole kind of different process. But I think in terms of, for resilience and adapting where we are now, I think having our own understanding of when we've been resilient and when we've adapted can help, because then we can use that with other clients. I think just helping them understand there is a choice in how you deal with this, because I think that choice is hugely, liberating when people realize, okay, it is actually up to me. Obviously, there's implications of whatever the choice is, but having made that choice, you can then own where it goes from there.
Thank you, Ruth. I think, as you're saying, now is a time more than ever we really need to role model for our coachees. Just before I bring things to a close, I just wanted to share with you our next webinar will be on the 14th of April at 2:00 UK time, and that's going to be on the topic of embodied coaching with myself and Monica Ross, who's one of our faculty members. Ruth, what would you like to say just to bring the session to a close from your side?
Well, thanks for the opportunity. I've never done anything like this, so I hope people got the answers and what they were looking for from it. It's a really, I would say it's an interesting topic, wouldn't I? But as you say, quite relevant for now. But I think that role modeling in terms of what we can do in terms of showing where our boundaries are, self-compassion and being positive, can make a big difference.
Thank you, Ruth. I really appreciate your support and time today. So thanks for dialing in. As I said earlier, the recording will be up on our YouTube channel by the end of the week. Go well in the meantime, and